Welcome to the Sustainable Heat Podcast, the go-to series for professionals in district heating, energy, and consultancy. Join us to stay ahead in the energy transition.
So they talk about modifying classic network configurations for lower temperatures, like they did in Brunsjö, Lund, Sweden in 2019.
So they took an existing system and made it more efficient by lowering the temperature of the water flowing through the pipes.
Yeah. Remember that cost reduction gradient we talked about?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Lower temperatures often mean lower costs and higher efficiency.
Right.
And they take that even further by talking about ultra low temperature configurations.
Wow.
That are designed to operate at really, really low temperatures. And they mention the agrothermy project in Wüstenrot, Germany from back in 2011.
I'm picturing these futuristic pipes carrying lukewarm water that somehow manages to keep whole buildings warm. It's kind of counterintuitive.
It is, yeah. But that's the beauty of innovation, right? Finding those unexpected solutions.
Finding those workarounds.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
And they even talk about using plastic pipes in some of these low temperature networks.
Wait, plastic pipes?
Yeah. They highlight examples from both Lund, Sweden, and Høje, Denmark, both from 2019.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I always thought it had to be those heavy-duty metal pipes. What's the advantage of using plastic?
Well, for one thing, they're more flexible and less prone to, corrosion.
Okay.
Especially at those lower temperatures.
Yeah.
They can also be easier and cheaper to install.
Right.
Which is a big consideration when building or upgrading these networks.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got network configurations and pipe materials all aimed at moving heat as efficiently as possible. What other strategies did they uncover?
One that stood out to me was the importance of tracking circulation flows.
Circulation flows?
Yeah, essentially making sure that the hot water is flowing through the network in the most efficient way.
Right.
Minimizing waste and maximizing heat delivery.
Okay, so it's like having a heat detective making sure every drop of hot water is doing its job.
That's a great way to put it. And this is another area where data is playing a key role. By monitoring these flows in real time, operators can identify areas where heat is being wasted and make adjustments to optimize the system.
Wow.
And they highlight examples from Ascends, Denmark, where they implemented this back in 2013, and Hamro Energy in Skoghall, Sweden, which was doing this in 2020.
It seems like data is becoming increasingly important for managing these systems. It's like every pipe has its own little Fitbit tracking its performance.
Yeah, I like that.
Helping us make smarter decisions.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
So it's not just about moving that heat efficiently, it's also about storing it strategically.
We got it.
Right?
Yeah.
This thermal battery.
Yes, the thermal batteries.
You were talking about earlier. It's like having a giant thermos for the whole city.
Yeah. And they explore all sorts of possibilities. From, those massive underground aquifers that we talked about.
Right.
Known as aquifer thermal energy storage. To repurpose mines. To, more conventional tank storage systems. They even talk about using buildings themselves as heat storage.
Wait, buildings as batteries? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's a little more complex, but essentially it involves utilizing the thermal mass of the building itself to store heat.
So the walls and floors of the building can actually absorb and release heat, helping to regulate the temperature.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really cool.
It's still a relatively new concept, but it has a lot of potential to be a very efficient and cost-effective way to store heat.
Right.
Especially in dense urban environments.
Yeah.
And there was research by Domenkovic et al. Back in 2018 showing that this is definitely possible.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so we've covered moving heat efficiently and storing it strategically.
Right.
But where are we getting all this sustainable heat from in the first place?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, and thankfully the report does not disappoint. So they dive into this whole category of possibilities around harnessing renewable heat sources, starting with the most powerful source of all.
Oh yeah, solar power. I always think of solar panels on rooftops, but I'm guessing we're talking about something a little different here.
Yeah. So we're not just talking about photovoltaic panels that generate electricity. We're talking about solar thermal collectors, which are specifically designed to capture heat from sunlight.
Okay, so it's like a giant magnifying glass concentrating the sun's rays to heat up water.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they highlight several examples of how this is being used for district heating. Silkeborg, Denmark has been doing this since 2011. Bredstrup, Denmark since 2018. And Senftenberg, Germany since 2016.
So even in places where it's not sunny all year round, we can still harness the power of the sun to heat our homes and businesses.
Absolutely.
Oh.
And they discuss both centralized and decentralized approaches.
Okay.
So centralized systems typically involve large-scale solar collector fields, while decentralized systems use smaller collectors, often installed on rooftops or integrated into building facades.
It sounds like they're exploring every possible way to capture those precious rays of sunshine.
They are.
That's awesome. But what about, those days when the sun isn't shining? Do we have any, backup options?
We do. And one of the most versatile tools in our sustainable heating arsenal is the heat pump.
Oh, yeah. I've heard a lot about heat pumps for, individual homes.
Right.
But how do they work on a district heating scale?
So they work on the same basic principle, but just on a much larger scale.
Okay.
Heat pumps are basically devices that move heat from one place to another,
Okay.
using a small amount of energy to transfer a larger amount of heat.
So they're not actually creating heat, they're just moving it around.
Exactly.
Wow.
And the beauty of that is that they can extract heat from a variety of sources, including the air, the ground, or even bodies of water.
So even on a cloudy day, we can still extract heat from the environment using heat pumps.
Precisely.
Wow.
And they mentioned a planned system in Silkeborg, Denmark, that's coming online in 2024. And it's going to use air-to-water heat pumps to extract heat from the air and use it to heat buildings.
Air-to-water heat pumps. That sounds like something out of a science fiction movie.
It does sound a bit futuristic.
Yeah.
But it's a very real and increasingly common technology.
That's so cool. All right, what else have we got? Okay, so we talked about all these incredible sources of renewable heat, from those solar thermal collectors to air-to-water heat pumps, even sewage water.
Right.
But what about those times when demand for heat spikes, like during a cold snap? How do these systems, handle those peak moments without resorting to, fossil fuel backups?
That's a really important question, because reliability is essential for any heating system, especially when people are relying on it to stay warm
Right.
during frigid weather. And the report tackles this head on. They have a whole section dedicated to meeting peak heat demands.
So what's the secret? Do they just build bigger, more powerful renewable energy plants?
Well, that's one approach, but it's not always the most efficient or cost effective.
Right.
Because if you have all this excess capacity that just sits idle most of the time, that's not ideal.
Right, right.
So instead, the report highlights a range of strategies that work together to create a more resilient and flexible system.
Okay, so it's about being smart and strategic, not just bigger.
Exactly.
Okay, I like it. What kind of strategies are we talking about?
Well, one approach that we've already touched on is harnessing the power of large heat storages.
Ah, yes.
Remember those thermal batteries we talked about?
Right, those giant underground aquifers, repurposed mines, even those buildings that act like giant sponges, soaking up heat and releasing it when we need it.
Exactly, yeah. Those large-scale storage systems play a crucial role in kind of smoothing out the peaks and valleys of demand.
Okay.
So you charge up the storage during periods of lower demand, typically when renewable energy is plentiful, and then you release that stored heat later on when everyone is cranking up their thermostats.
It's like having a savings account for heat. You're storing it away for a rainy or, I guess, snowy day.
I love that analogy. Yeah. And the report highlights a really great example of this in action. At Vin in Hudiksvall, Sweden, they took an old oil storage facility and transformed it into this massive heat storage system back in 2018.
Really?
Yeah. And the results were really impressive. Not only did they reduce their costs and emissions,
Wow.
but they also gained much greater operational flexibility
Okay.
throughout the year.
That's great. So heat storage is a crucial piece of the puzzle, but the report also mentions something called demand side management. What exactly is that, and how does it fit into the picture?
So demand side management is this fascinating approach that focuses on influencing when and how customers use heat.
Okay.
So it's not just about supplying heat, it's about managing the demand for heat in a way that optimizes the whole system.
So instead of just reacting to demand, we're kind of proactively shaping it.
Exactly.
Okay, I like where this is going. How do we actually get people to change their behavior when it comes to heating, though?
Well, one really effective approach is to incentivize customers to kind of shift their heat consumption away from those peak periods.
So rewarding people for using less energy during those high demand hours, kind of like how some electricity companies offer, discounts for off-peak usage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's some really cool examples of this in action. Node.ai and Karlshamn Energy in Karlshamn, Sweden They implemented a system back in 2012 where they connected like 90 buildings to a demand-side management network.
90 buildings all working together to manage their heat consumption. How does that work?
It's pretty clever.
Yeah.
So they essentially treat those buildings as like remote heat storage units.
Okay.
So during peak demand periods, they can slightly lower the temperature in those buildings.
Right.
Essentially drawing on their thermal mass
Yeah.
to kind of reduce strain on the overall system.
So it's like those buildings are donating a little bit of their stored heat to help out the rest of the network.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
And it's all managed automatically.
Wow.
Through this intelligent network.
It sounds very futuristic.
It is, yeah. And another cool example is Stockholm Exergy. Remember those smart substations we talked about earlier?
Right, the ones that act like the brain of the heating system, constantly monitoring and adjusting things.
Those are the ones, yeah. So those digital gateways can also be used to implement demand-side management strategies.
So they're not just optimizing the network itself, they're also communicating with individual customers to help them manage their energy use.
Exactly. It's a great example of how digitalization is transforming how we manage energy.
Yeah.
By collecting data on customer behavior and using, intelligent algorithms, they can anticipate these peak demand periods.
Yeah.
And then proactively kind of nudge people towards more efficient energy use.
Wow. It sounds like those smart systems are really becoming like the conductors of this whole sustainable heating orchestra.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. But let's move beyond managing those peaks and talk about another fascinating aspect highlighted in the report.
Okay.
Heat recycling.
Heat recycling, yes.
It sounds like we're not just creating heat from scratch anymore. We're also finding like clever ways to capture and reuse existing heat.
Exactly. Closing the loop.
Right.
Finding those like pockets of heat that are being wasted and putting them to good use.
I love that.
And the report highlights some really innovative examples of how industries are like stepping up to the plate and becoming both producers and consumers of sustainable heat.
Picturing a network where heat is constantly flowing, not just from like power plants and renewable energy sources, but also from factories and businesses and like even our homes.
That's a great way to visualize it. Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's like the circulatory system for heat constantly redistributing and reusing this valuable resource.
I like that.
And they start by diving into a sector that might surprise you. Fuel refineries.
Fuel refiners, aren't those the places that, produce all the fossil fuels we're trying to get rid of?
Traditionally, yes. Mm-hmm. But the refineries of the future are going to look very different. We're talking about facilities that produce what are called electrofuels or synthetic fuels.
Electrofuels?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with those.
So they're really cool. Essentially, they're created using renewable energy to combine hydrogen with carbon or nitrogen, resulting in these like cleaner alternatives to those traditional fossil fuels.
So instead of extracting fossil fuels from the ground, we're creating synthetic fuels using renewable energy.
Yeah, it's a pretty remarkable process.
It's like alchemy.
It is.
Wow.
And what's even cooler is that these electrofuel refineries generate a lot of excess heat.
Okay.
That can be captured and used for district heating.
So while they're busy making, cleaner fuels, they're also providing sustainable heat for the surrounding communities.
Exactly. It's a double win.
That's amazing.
And the report highlights flagship pony in Örnsköldsvik, Sweden, which is planning to have this up and running by 2025, and the liquid wind facility in Sundsvall, Sweden, also slated for 2025-2026.
Wow.
As prime examples of this kind of synergistic approach.
It's a great example of how different industries can, work together to create a more sustainable future.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of synergy, the report also highlights the heat recycling potential of another exciting technology, green hydrogen production.
Yeah.